Yeah, I don't know
Thank
how this is going to work out, but we won't make this public. I'll just send it to you. So the first sentence, and I want to spend some time on that sentence or that paragraph, which is right off the bat, it's kind of awkward, and I want to try to understand what he's saying. He goes, human reason has a peculiar fate, and the translation is literally fate, Schicksal, um, in one kind of its cognitions. So what we learned that there are multiple cognitions and there are multiple kinds, but in one kind there is a peculiar fate, and that is it is troubled. If you were to translate it today, maybe you could say literally harassed by questions that it cannot dismiss. So you are here. So as reason is posing itself some questions because they are posed to it by the nature of reason itself, uh, but that it also cannot answer because they surpass human reason's every ability. So here a little strange thing going on with reason. I mean, Kant is always considered to be the philosopher of enlightenment, of reason, etc. But here, right at the very first sentence of the first edition, 1871, he makes this observation about the nature of reason. So, what does it mean to ask questions that is legitimate questions in the sense that they are posed by the nature of reason itself, but it cannot answer? Yeah.
I had to read that like 16
Uh
times
huh.
to figure it out. But but I think it has something to do with the other idea he talks about the thing in itself, like there are aspects of reality that we are able to question, but we never actually know. The whole process of asking questions is cyclical because when you ask a question about a thing, you're projecting your own concepts of the thing. Um, and that's what you're asking about. You're asking about these appearances or what you can experience based on your a priori
Hmm.
concepts of the thing. So it's not really, you can't understand it. It's just reflected back.
Did you get that? Can you hear? No. Okay. So Esther was making the case that it has something to do with the nature of a priori concepts that reason uses with respect to experience, and it works. But you're right, once it goes beyond experience, that things that we cannot, by experience, it means something very specific as sense perception, then we cannot really know. And yes, that's 16 times is good then if you read 16 times. But let's just take one step further and maybe it will clarify. So then he continues, our reason falls into this perplexity through no fault of its own. So, really? Isn't it reason's fault? Why do you say like that it is not its fault? Reason starts from principle, and that's the idea that you explained really well. Reason starts with principles. So we have certain principles, rules according to which we operate, right? Uh, falls into this perplex. Reason starts from principles that it cannot avoid using in the course of experience. So certain principles work well, apparently, with respect to experience. Then this experience at the same time sufficiently justifies it in using. So, as you said, if you use it with respect to experience, it's fine. By means of these principles, however, our reason, I mean, there is no however, but our reason, as indeed its nature requires it to do so. So it is natural for reason to take these principles and ascend to ever higher to more remote conditions. So let's just think of an example how we do this. So you all have the power of reason, and let's think of a condition and then how we can move to remote conditions. You are up on the screen too. Can you see yourself? Think of an example, like something that works in experience that you somehow, yes.
I guess actually gave a good example last time. We know that people die, but we ask these questions about what happens after death, what happens to like their identity, their consciousness. Would those be the more remote conditions, like things we can't actually experience or
Right. The question on the table is that there is we experience people dying, and then something happens up to that point. We imagine that something is going to happen afterwards, but we can never know this. Yes, that would be one example, but it seems to be more categorical because death is like the end of human life as we know it. So I can imagine reason stopping and saying like, okay, I don't want to speculate. So, but I mean, it's a good example. Maybe we can find a way around it. But is there any other, like, more metaphysical? I mean, this is metaphysical too, but.
I can imagine if you have like a practical problem. If you have a practical problem, for example, like I don't know, dealing with like childcare or something like that, I imagine that can involve like moral reasoning. So like if you say, is it correct to raise my child in X way? That's a practical problem that people reason with among themselves that then can resolve into higher moral issues. Like, for example, how much autonomy do children have, or what it, like stuff like that. I don't know.
Should we not speculate about those? That what kind of? Yes, here it seems like we fall into a trap and cannot answer those questions. So the idea is that, theoretically speaking, it is questions that it cannot answer. So practical questions, I mean, you probably read the rest of the preface. He reserves practical questions such as childcare, etc., to a different cognition of reason. So here we are really restricting ourselves to knowing, theoretically. So, okay, you are a scientist, maybe. So you have this idea that something happens. You observe something happens, and you say there's a cause for that, right? It happened because of something. There is hurricane. It's because climate change. The, our planet is warming up, etc. So there's a cause for that. But there's a cause of that too, right? And there's a cause of that too. So by following this causal chain, you can say, well, there must be a first cause that started everything. I can see in front of me all the experience that has a cause, and logically speaking, because I'm a rational human being, that must be a cause for, so there must be a first cause. God. Is that not reasonable? Can I answer that question? Well, I cannot answer the question theoretically. That's why he says I had to restrict knowledge to make room for faith. So right off the bat, in the preface, you observe this tendency in Kant that the knowledge of God is not theoretical knowledge, and it is not a question of knowledge at all, actually, but it's a question of faith.
So what makes something a question of knowledge? Would be the, I guess, that the question of knowledge is something that it makes sense to think about it, thinking about it. if there's something that if the moment you start, you tend to think about it, gets you into like predictions and yeah, it stops being
Mhm.
logical, then like you can sort of target that and like that's where like you can want not to go.
By doing this, he says, however, human reason plunges into darkness and contradiction. Now, I'm not really sure I want to say contradiction. Well, he says it, so we have to. But is it contradictory to think that there must be a first cause of everything? Does it appear to be contradictory to you? Yes? Oh. Who wants to talk? I did. You can unmute yourself. No? Yeah.
Okay. Didn't I interrupt anyone?
No, no, go ahead.
No. All right. I think the question itself is contradictory because when we're saying that is there is there is there the first cause for everything? I mean that first cause also might have its cause, and that first cause also has its first cause, and the first cause, and so I don't think it makes sense.
Well, the contradiction emerges from the idea that the proposition that there must be a first cause for everything is equally valid as what you just said. There cannot be a first cause because there will always be a further cause or previous cause of that. So these two propositions are equally valid while they contradict each other or they oppose to each other. That's the definition of contradiction.
What are those two proposition again?
That there is a first cause, there must be a first cause, and as you said, there cannot be a first cause because there will be a first cause of that, and then first cause of that. So this is a contradiction, darkness. He says, like, we speculate about things. So in short, just to make it a little bit more casual, as far as we talk about things that are beyond the bounds of possible experience, then we cannot answer those questions. Now, you can imagine like this. So that I can really go back. I can go back to the very beginning. So it is still within the possibility of my experience because we obviously make claims about the past. You know, scientists tell us like we did their carbon aging and this is 5 million years old. And you go like, how do you know? Are you there? No, we just concluded from our experience that it must be 5 million years old or whatever. But therefore, it is conceivable to go back and back and back and back within our experience, because here experience is defined a little bit more generally, not just me being present there, but I can make inferences about it. But a first beginning is the absolute beginning. It is not a number of years that count, but it is categorically the beginning of everything, the beginning of time, for example, or the beginning of space. One of the things that we say, like, you ask the question according to Kant, like, if you keep going, technically, in the universe, will you come to an end? Is there a limit to space? And there are like, this is a medieval question too. People come, represent the end of the earth, and then you stick your, you put your stick out, and then it goes further. So it cannot really end logically, but it cannot not end logically either. So our idea does not conceive the possibility of infinite either. So this is set of questions that Kant says we cannot answer one way or the other. And that's the realm of metaphysics. And that's the realm of speculation. We say things and we propose them as if they are knowledge, but it's not.
I have a, so like, I guess like, one thing that's much stuff was like, oh, like, yeah, so, here's this project, because he says like reason has this fate, and it's like compelled to it, but then like, so is this project trying to break away from that fate, and then doesn't that like, given what fate like is, like the fate is like at least like, to me like makes like I think the fate is like implying this sort of predestination kind of thing. And if
When you say fate, F-A-T-E.
yeah,
Okay.
and if reason's fate is like to be sort of compelled to keep doing these kinds of methods, to keep attempting this. So is this project to try to break away from that fate? And but then does it make sense to even like yeah, like since fate is sort of predestination and like the way it's being determined, does it even make sense to start doing that?
Okay. The question is, well, if I were to, can you like turn on your Zoom?
Okay.
Well, if you have questions, just join the Zoom, and that way you guys can hear too. So Daniel was asking about the nature of the question. So are we supposed to overcome our faith with Kant? What's the project? This is faith, reason does that. We inescapably ask these questions, but how can we escape this? Well, that's really true. That's Kant's project, that he's going to try to what he calls, yeah, the critique of reason. Namely, we are going to try to figure out the boundaries, the limits of reason. So he says this quite explicitly, that they don't have these metaphysical speculations. They don't have this critical project. And critique comes from the Greek term krinein, which means drawing boundaries. So reason is performing. You need to.
Sorry.
uh, Reason performs this critical analysis on itself. Namely, reason draws its own boundaries. What is it that I can know? What is it I cannot know? And what are my powers? How can I make universal a priori statements, necessary statements? What is the limit of that? And right off the bat for you, for Kant, that is always possible experience. Possible experience is the limit. If what I say is within the bounds of possible experience, then it is acceptable critical knowledge. Yes.
But, so I'm a little confused because later in the second preface, he starts talking about this sort of ability for practical reason to transcend
Yes.
the realm of just experience.
Yes.
I'm sure we're going to get to talk about that, but how does that stay true given the fact that we think this critique that describes the bound that reason has?
Okay, so you can think of it in one of two ways. First, that he is making a clear distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy. But it also applies to different aspects of reason. So understanding is the domain of knowledge, cognition, theoretical cognition. Sometimes he calls it speculative cognition. So after Kant, that there's a clear distinction of we can know theoretically. By theoretical here means empirical in the sense of what we can observe with possible experience, as opposed to practical problems that as was talking about, they don't have any possibility of knowledge. So you can never know how you should raise your child if it's a really practical question. Now, of course, today we theoretically say in order for your child to be healthy, you need to do this. In order for your child to be psychologically balanced, you have to do this. This can still be questions of theoretical knowledge, but it is morally not something that you can prescribe. And that's really the problem that today science, as it is for Kant, would be the theoretical knowledge, tries to make practical recommendations. But strictly speaking, what science does, climate science or physics or geology, whatever, their claims are about possible experience and theoretical knowledge, not about what ought to happen. Now, science can teach us if you continue like this, you are going to destroy your planet. Well, you won't really destroy the planet, you will destroy yourself within the planet. Now, the question as to whether we should or should not destroy ourselves as a species is not a theoretical question. I happen to think we should. You might disagree. I think human beings had their time. I mean, it will still have a lot of time too, but maybe in terms of what ought to happen. Now, of course, for Kant, that cannot be a valid argument because for practical philosophy, human being is the center for Kant, rational animal. So he would probably not agree with me with respect to how human beings should disappear. And as a human being, I cannot rationally will that, blah, blah. But science cannot answer that question. So science cannot tell us how we are supposed to live. Now, it can give us knowledge about if you want to live healthy, if you want to do this, you should do this, etc. So there is a very strict in Kant distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy. Is that clear to you guys? Are you okay there? Okay.
So,
Yes, go ahead.
so as far as I understood, theoretical knowledge um, is, in other words, empirical knowledge. Are these two the same?
No,
No.
because empirical knowledge for Kant is what he calls in the questions a posteriori. But there is also a critique of pure reason in which when reason reflects upon its own powers and tries to delimit those powers, then that's also within the domain of theoretical knowledge, theoretical philosophy. So everything that he is going to say with respect to a priori principles, for example, even though they are not strictly speaking empirical, but transcendental aesthetic, for example, is within the domain of theoretical philosophy.
Wait, so when he speaks of experience, he literally just means like sense, like our five senses, like the classic five senses.
Yes.
Because I would, you know, wonder, is cognizing not its own experience?
Say it again. What do you mean cognizing?
Well, he's saying what and how much can understanding and reason cognize independently of all experience?
It can only cognize itself.
Huh?
It can only cognize itself.
So
Now,
there's no connection. There's no connection between the sensorial experiences,
sense
the sense experiences.
well, that exists. Of course, you have self-perception and you have knowledge about the external world.
Yeah.
You also can come up with principles that will answer certain questions of metaphysics a priori, universal and necessary, like what substance is, what causality is, mostly the most important that we are going to concentrate throughout the reading of this text, the idea of causality, because he learns that from Hume, that there is really no possibility of empirically determining causality. So yes, that is empirical knowledge, but things that I know about, things that reason knows about itself as a power,
Mm.
understanding, is also theoretical knowledge, and they are not empirical. They are transcendental, which for Kant would mean almost always that which is the condition for the possibility of experience. And that's the crucial term that you are going to um, encounter throughout the reading. What makes experience possible? Yes, experience is actual, but what makes it possible? So then he talks about the fact that metaphysics used to be the queen of sciences, and now it is in turmoil because sciences advance, produce knowledge, and metaphysics still deals with the same questions. It's like Hecuba in Metamorphosis, the queen who is lamenting the loss of her powers. So it's a kind of Kant being, I don't know, interesting, I suppose. So what does he mean by the critique of power? And then he starts this on page 8, which is really the crucial thing. And it is a call to reason. This is the top of page 8. That call to reason to take on, once again, the most difficult of all its tasks, i.e., that of self-cognition, and to set up a tribunal that will make reason secure in its rightful claims and dismiss all baseless pretensions. So rather than speculating about metaphysical questions, reason has to concentrate on itself and understand its boundaries and self-cognition, which is also cognition, and then say which questions can reasonably be answered and which questions cannot. So this becomes a very, in different forms, a fundamental trait of philosophy. Because you pose certain questions, and we believe in the power of the question. You can ask every question, but you can also ask that question back to yourself and say, why am I asking this question? Why is this a question for me? Is there a possible answer to that question? So this is really sort of self-consciousness in a sense, self-cognition. Like, why am I bothered by this question? Why am I asking this question? Why am I bothered by as to whether there's a God or not? And human beings do that, especially in the anthropology of religion. Like, oh, human beings are weak, therefore they ask the question what's going to happen to them after death, therefore they invent God, blah, blah, blah. Or they are really afraid of the unknown, therefore they pretend to know. But that's the kind of, rather than assuming that there is an answer to questions like the beginning of the universe, why are we even asking this question? So this is a kind of philosophical self-reflection. So if you read our department webpage and then says philosophy is concerned with perennial questions, that's absolutely wrong, actually. You are not concerned with perennial questions because questions are never the same once you perform this self-cognition, and there are going to be different types of questions. And you can do that, I think, in every discipline. So like, yesterday, I don't know whether you watched the debate, and then there's a question, and then you go, why the hell are you asking this question? Why is it even a question? Can there be an answer to that question, or is it really an honest question, or is it a possible answer question, etc.? So the critique for Kant is really like, what is it that I can know legitimately and what is it I cannot? Can I draw the boundaries once and for all? And that's really a very ambitious and, if you ask me, a crazy activity, because Kant wants to determine this once and for all. These are the powers of reason. Reason can only do this, and in 1781, and I failed a little bit, between 1781 and 1787, I answered this question, universally for all human beings. That's the project.
I guess like question about I guess like possibility.
Yeah, turn on your
Yes, like, cause like I feel like a lot of it, like there's like stuff about possible experience, different for possibility. And I'm just thinking like what does the possible for in that like if like I get the sense like to a degree there is still some contingency there, like because if even if like he finds like the sense for possibility, even if like grab these things, I don't think that, like what is possible itself like is that what is possible itself like cannot change. If that makes sense.
sure. The experience always changes in the sense that, but Kant believes what makes experience for human beings possible is formally, in terms of its form, not content, human understanding. First, human sensibility, that we can be affected by the external world, space and time, we'll discuss those, and then concepts of understanding categories. Now he's going to demonstrate, and that's really what he considers to be the most important section of the text, deduction of the pure concepts of understanding on page 10. So that's why we are going to do up to deduction, because that's what he considers to be most important. What makes experience possible is a universal and necessary statement. Human experience is only possible in time. Human experience is only possible within space. Now, as to whether this particular experience itself is possible or actual or contingent is another question, and you are absolutely right. I might have this experience, I might not have that experience, etc. But it is impossible for me to have an experience outside of time. Now I can have experience outside of space, kind of, in my own mind, dreaming and blah, blah. But time, for example, is the condition for the possibility of experience, for human sensibility. Maybe there is a being who perceives outside of time. That's not us. And no human being will ever experience outside of time. Yes.
Well,
Can you
I
turn on your
I had
A counterexample.
counter example? Okay.
But I realized that if it's based solely on like the individual's experience, like no single individual can experience outside of time. There's this one of Einstein's theories is that if you send somebody off into space, their clock slows down, right? Because they're experiencing gravity different. And so in that sense, would they be considered experiencing outside of time? But then I realized like they're still experiencing time, it's just a different sort of time. It's a different
Well, that sort of exceeds my knowledge of physics, and I don't want to speculate. It is true that Kant is operating with a Newtonian worldview in terms of not the absoluteness, but kind of inescapability of time. Now, I'm not really sure, as far as I understand it, relativity theory annuls time as much as it, by connecting it. Can you all hear me? Okay. By relativizing time to speed, among other things, it is not annuling time and talking about an experience outside of time. It might talk about a different experience of time than we used to in terms of uniformity, and we all experience 15 seconds in the same way, but maybe if we just shoot you into the space and bring you back, you will experience 2 seconds when we experience 2 years or something like that. But again, in terms of what we can know, see, observe, and experience, and hence bring to cognition is in time for Kant. So now, that's the condition for the possibility. Now, which means that thing might be possible or actual, but without its condition, it would not be possible. And it would not be actual either. I mean, that's to the possibility, sort of precedes actuality. So he looks at something, and that's a really excellent, regardless of what you think about Kant, um, something very good that you should perform. Like you observe something, and then you say, what makes this possible? How did this come about? So this is like the first philosophical moment, even when he refers to Plato, he's going to say, we understand Plato better than he understood himself. It's like you are looking away from the thing. You are trying to understand its condition. And that's really the philosophical moment. You don't just look at things like, oh, what is this? I look at it, but you look at the causes, the way in which that thing came about. And that's still like the all scientific activity, I would say, because if people say science is just mere observation, that's not the case. Because people were looking around in the Middle Ages and in antiquity too. Everybody always looked around. Nobody was like, oh, I'm going to produce knowledge by closing my eyes, etc. So it's not really just observation, but it is looking at away and understanding its cause. So, okay, so by critique of pure reason, therefore, he is not talking about like what happened, what was being said, the books, and he says, and systems. I'm not going to criticize previous systems, what people said, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to critique the power itself, from which you understand reason is always a power, which ironically also means a possibility. Now, when we come to practical philosophy, that's all, well, we won't come, but once you do. So all human beings are rational. So you read a statement like that as an actuality. I look at all the people, they sound rational. And then that contradicts your experience, of course, if you watch television, for example. And you say, oh, these people are not rational. They are not thinking the way a rational person might think. Now, for Kant, that's fine. Reason is always a possibility. And he would say the only cause that, the only, I'm going to say reason, but it's a different reason. The only reason that you are actually shocked that people don't have rationality, that they don't demonstrate rationality, is because you anticipate that power in them. You don't go to a cat and say, I would not have expected this from you. I mean, you say that if you are too close, but like you don't expect other creatures to perform the possibility of reason. You expect from human beings because it's a power. Power means potentiality, potency, possibility, not necessarily actuality. So don't ever read reason as a set of established actual activities as much as a power. So he's going to criticize that power. And once and for all, he is going to determine what is beyond the most effective exercise of that power. I mean, if you exercise that power effectively, you are going to know this. But this is, however, while you exercise your reason, you are never going to find the answer to those questions. Which is also from the perspective of us, like, oh, we should go back to Kant, we should all be rational, we are all reason should rule. Sometimes people today use science as a kind of substitute for reason. It's like, I believe in science. which you don't even know what it is. You're just probably appealing to something like reason. Human beings must be rational, etc. And but Kant himself says, yes, but that's very limited. I mean, not very limited, but it's limited in terms of its ability to know. So someone like Kierkegaard, because this is 19th century, or Nietzsche, come after Kant and say, philosophy, to the extent that we understand it with respect to science, has nothing to say about human morality. Science cannot teach us morality, which, I still believe that because science itself must be like that. And then we criticize human beings like, oh, scientists are also human beings. Sure, fine. And they make decisions that are practical, and to that extent, they are not any wiser in terms of moral questions. That should not be surprising us because that's not even their domain. Now, they might have a better mastery of cognition, of what we can know or not, but that's not going to allow us, in fact, quite the opposite. That will never allow us to say something beyond experience. Now, he makes this case several times already in the text. Just wanted to, I don't want to talk about certainty and distinctness and those categories yet. We can come back to those just because I want to cover certain aspects of the second part. But it has been an hour, so, and I can hardly breathe, so we'll take a break. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if I fully understood the the term theoretical and practical.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I saw like these two concepts on page 16. Um, Reason's cognition can be referred to the object of that cognition in two ways. One, theoretical cognition and practical cognition. And do you mean that this practical cognition is actually impossible? Something that we can never get to know?
Um, well, here you need to be careful about what you mean by knowledge. So theoretical domain, or what he considers to be the domain of the reason with respect to the empirical, that which can be observed, is the domain of what is actual, what is the case, to know what is. But the practical is not about what is, it is about what ought to be.
Oh, okay.
And yes, what ought to be cannot be known in the same way that what is can be known. Because as human beings, we observe things in outside world, we have knowledge, we have theoretical, what he considers theoretical. Now, you need to be careful here. Theoretical here doesn't mean the way in which we use theory today, like, theory as opposed to practice or something like that. This is theoretical, speculative knowledge, scientific knowledge, knowledge about what is the case. Because we perceive, we receive, we take in presentations from the external world. So I see the sun, I see I should look at the sun, but I look at the sort of nature and try to figure out what is the case. But then we are also human beings who are capable of producing presentation. It is not in nature that, I don't know, like things that we do. It is we produce that. And we do that sometimes according to what should be the case. So we have a kind of peculiar imagination. We say, it's here, it should not be here. Now, that might have theoretical consequences, but if it is moral, ethical, then it is something that cannot be known by just looking at it. Because by looking at things, you only understand what is the case, but never what should be the case. And we are not just natural beings who act according to laws of nature. Now that's Kant's practical moral theory.
Um,
Yeah,
can I just read this short paragraph on page 16?
sure.
The last paragraph,
Well,
my philosophy has um,
your voice is echoing. Where are you?
page 16.
The last paragraph.
Yeah, it says, now insofar as there is to be reason in these sciences, something in them must be cognized a priori.
A priori.
Moreover, reason's cognition, at this part, reason's cognition can be referred to the object of the cognition in two ways, either in order merely to determine the object and its concept, which must be supplied from elsewhere, or in order to make it actual as well. The first is reason's theoretical, the second, its practical cognition. So I I could not really make the connection between this expression, make it actual, and the normative sense that you just elaborated about the practical knowledge.
Okay. Yeah.
That actually, that,
That goes right along with my question. I was wondering if the understanding the thing in itself is under the realm of practical cognition.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, I was also thinking that this practical knowledge, since Kant said make it actual, so I thought it was something related to the thing in itself.
Okay. Good question. Now, it is related to thing in itself with respect to practical cognition, but make it actual literally means very simply things that we do as human beings. We act, we produce presentations. We are not just receiving those presentations. They are not supplied from elsewhere, namely outside, but our actions, our moral actions, like I speak, I lie, I slap people. I don't, but like, I engage in certain activities. So these are the presentations that I, as a human being, produce. Now, this might be just because I'm a natural being and I act according to my desires or according to laws of nature, but it might also be because I'm a moral being that I do things that don't occur in nature. So I make it actual. We produce presentations. We are not just passive receptors of appearances. We act out of a domain of thing in itself, which can never be known. Therefore, I can never know anybody to be free or not. That is not a cognitive knowledge, like theoretical knowledge. Because freedom is the property of a will that produces presentations itself. So that's why making it actual really means like I act out of a different kind of causality. And that causality is my freedom. Therefore, we constantly punish each other because we don't just sort of say, you did that, you should not have done that. How can I not have done that? It's nature, it's my nature. I'm I'm born this way, whatever. So no, you always have the possibility to not act according to what is considered to be the law of nature. That's why you go to court and say, oh, I was determined to do this. It wasn't my free will. You will be punished for your free will, but you cannot be punished for things that are natural, that you didn't make actual, they or my actual. Yes.
Uh, in this realm of making things actual, does that apply to not just like concepts and questions and things like that, but also like an external physical reality? Like we make
Sure.
this table actual because we act according, we change our behavior because we perceive it as this thing.
But I want to restrict it to the human interaction. intersubjectivity, because yes, we do certain things that don't occur in nature, but we don't manufacture them by breaking the laws of nature. So we can manufacture tables because we understand how nature works. We understand how heavy that it can carry that. We know physics, we know manufacturing, we know engineering. These are all have its rules, and we follow those uh, that are given to us from without. But uh, interacting with human beings, producing presentations intersubjectively, is more like what he means in terms of moral philosophy. So making actual in that sense is simply that.
So if I understood it right,
What's that?
so if I understood it right, freedom belongs to the domain of practical knowledge.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Like, so this,
Can you open your thing? Okay. Who are you? Oh, Daniel. Okay, go ahead. No, no, I meant in terms of your name.
Yeah. So like when he says in the same paragraph, it's concept which must be supplied from elsewhere. Is that like is this like
Where is it? Where is it? Sorry.
reasons either in order to merely determine the object and its concept, which must be supplied from elsewhere? When he's talking about
Uh-huh.
yeah. So like is that in reference to like receiving sort of having the knowledge being given by experience? That's the elsewhere.
Yeah,
Yes, okay, okay.
I think so. Yeah.
just because like
Because when he then goes to the example of math, and like
how like
theoretical
theoretical definition works in that.
scenario, and he talks about how like it's it's reason the reason puts the concept into its object. So I'm like confused as to why he says because the question is not actually the object, he puts it after the concept, which like if it's okay, in order to merely determine the object, you must just apply from elsewhere. But okay, that makes the experience thing. But then he puts it after concept, and then later on goes on to talk about how with using the example of math to explain theoretical cognition, it's that you sort of that you attribute to this thing first what he what is it talent guy
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Got it. Uh-huh.
basically, and so it's he's put into this this concept. So
Uh-huh.
why is this really quite essential to use that?
Okay. Math has a peculiar status there. Math will still be uh, well, we need to really articulate the concepts of synthetic, a priori, etc., to fully understand what he's trying to say with math. But in that paragraph, um, he switches to two sciences, theoretical cognitions by reason are determined their objects a priori. Now, determining the object a priori is a complicated sentence because it doesn't mean that science makes up objects in the world. So it, it is still supplied from elsewhere, but we have these concepts according to which we make them into objects to be perceived in the first place. And that's the difficult thing to understand. I think that if we get to the Copernican revolution, that will make sense. Now, he says we need a revolution because most of our problems with metaphysics comes from the fact whether what we know corresponds to objects, whether our intuitions, whether our presentations correspond to objects. And from that, we can never make any universal and necessary, i.e. a priori claims, because everything that you know through experience is always subject to change. Experience can never ever give human beings knowledge that is stable. Therefore, you need metaphysics, you speculate, etc. But for the most part, empirical knowledge, to the extent that you are restricted to external objects, is always contingent. Now, hence, we say certain things about the world, and who cares? Like, if it is empirical knowledge, you know, whatever we say about COVID now, it's going to be false in 2 years, right? And maybe things will change too. Maybe, it will mutate, and maybe we will mutate. So we can never make claims like that. Yes.
Could you give an example of something in a science that could be cognized a priori?
Every event has a cause.
Okay.
Every event has a cause, even though event is an empirical concept. As a statement, it is universal and necessary. Science wouldn't say, oh, it's a miracle. This happened? I don't know. It happened. Sometimes things happen. Well, I mean, you shouldn't even say that. It was like divine intervention, like some miracle happened because it has no cause. I mean, even miracles have cause, I guess, some divine intervention, but it just happened. So every event has a cause is a kind of a priori cognition that we operate with. Now, again, if you are into quantum mechanics and the issue about whether it's actually the cause, etc., we can discuss that. But the operation of the scientific activity really presupposes something like that. So, but every statement that we make about the external world that comes us through a posteriori, after experience, a posteriori simply means after experience, experientially, in terms of perception, is contingent and not necessary. And technically, you can say all the scientists say, like, oh, yeah, no, maybe. I mean, it's good to rely on our empirical knowledge. It is good that you take, drugs and fix yourself, blah, blah. But you can say, well, yeah, that knowledge is really not compelling because it might always be different. I mean, I love this in all the sort of when people in all the sciences, especially social sciences, but also natural sciences, talk about their finding as if they discovered something like amazing, etc. And you are like, well, yes, you observed this, you made this conclusion, but it might change, and it is probably going to change. And whatever we say about climate change today, even though there is a huge consensus about among the scientists, etc., is still a contingent knowledge. Now, he says, well, we cannot make any necessary and universal claims, so that gives us like the skepticism. Like, I mean, I don't believe in anything, everything can be different, I don't really, and I'm sort of indifferent to it anyway, because I feel like that sometimes. But when I listen people making claims about the external world, like just wait a little, just a couple of years, it will be different. And then if you really actually sort of systematically observe things that we said will happen 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you can realize they didn't happen, or they happened things that we didn't really anticipate. So we constantly talk about with sort of certainty with respect to the empirical, but when you actually observe that, you see that's not the case. And even people who do the history of science observe that how it developed over the years, you really don't see that sort of internal methodological consistency. It is contingent.
So,
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, so theoretical cognition works.
Yes, it is hard to remember.
Theoretical cognition works.
It's
It works
prior.
like you want to infer until it goes on through the
Make
claims to knowledge from it goes on to make claims to knowledge a posteriori. Is that theoretical cognition?
Well, not quite there yet. So he will say, let's try with respect to theoretical knowledge, not to fit our presentations and concepts to objects, but let's say that, okay, so I'll just read on page 21. Thus far, it has been assumed, this is the paragraph on page 21, the middle of that paragraph. Thus far, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to objects. On that presupposition, however, all our attempts to establish something about them a priori by means of concepts through which our cognition would be expanded have come to nothing. That's skepticism. We make claims about the external world and they change. Let us therefore try to find out by attempt. Let's experiment. This is experiment, but it's not like scientific experience. It's like versuchen, which is attempt, try. Let's try whether we shall not make better progress in the problems of metaphysics if we assume that objects must conform to our cognition. Now he says, for knowledge to be possible, certain objects must be given to us. But we determine how those objects are determined, how those objects are given to us. And our form of understanding is make certain things objects for us in the first place. Yes.
Is that what?
Is that what he means when later when he starts talking about like natural sciences, when he says reason has insight only to what it itself produces according to its own plan?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Now, of course, you need to be careful here. We do not create objects as physical things outside. So I just think of something and something magically appears or anything like that. It is just that when something presentation given to us, for that to be possible for me to be received and processed as cognition, it must conform certain rules. That is the structure of human reason. We can only perceive in space and time. We can only have cognition with respect to concepts. It is us, human beings, who process that information. Now, that doesn't make it subjective. Well, actually, it does make it subjective, but subjective here is not really the way in which we understand subjective. It doesn't make it bad. It actually makes it universal and necessary. Objective is particular and contingent. That's really Kant's sort of reversal, or in fact, our reversal of Kant's idea that we completely use the terms objective and subjective wrongly. Not wrongly, but thoughtlessly, let's say. We say if something is subjective, it is not subjective to me as a human being, it is subjective to all rational beings, to all our understanding, which is the same. And yes, we all perceive in space and time. Just because it is subjective doesn't mean that it is contingent. In fact, quite the opposite. It makes it necessary. All presentation, therefore, must be given to us in space and time. You might ask, what presentations can be given to us outside of space and time? That he would call thing in itself. Because since space and time are the forms of our intuition as human beings, we cannot attribute them to objects. And it is good not to attribute them to objects because our knowledge of objects is always empirical, therefore contingent. Hence, if we were to attribute them to objects, we could never really make universal and necessary statements about them. But we do make statements about space and time that are universal and necessary, hence a priori, which means there are only 3 dimensions of space, unless you are in a teenage movie where they see 4 or 5 dimensions of them. or space is always one-dimensional. Nobody perceives things that happened before, things that happened after before. Nobody has a perception that goes backwards. Nobody perceives something that happened in the past. You can remember it, you can recall it, but we are all somehow sharing this one-dimensional time. Hence, we can make, with respect to objects, universal and necessary statements that only apply to objects as appearances, not as things in themselves, because we also allow the possibility that objects might be completely different than we observe. Now, Kant doesn't believe that, but he leaves it as a kind of, since it is from our perspective, he needs the possibility open for it to be otherwise. So maybe there is a being that perceives in 5 dimensions of time. I don't even understand what that means. Like we know, I watch. Okay, stop this.
Kind of inherent in us. So does that mean that um, we're sensing, we're supplying ourselves with something that is inherent in us whenever we're having experience? Because we always use the refer to the time and space.
That seems a little misleading because we are not supplying the content of what we sense, perceive. We supply the form, the way in which we receive present intuitions from the external world.
So time and space are forms of intuition.
Yeah. That's the way in which we can receive intuition.
Okay.
So the content is supplied by the external world. The form is supplied by human beings, by our understanding. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the relationship between intuition and cognition then?
Well,
How does one become the other?
okay, so you are already asking questions that pushes you towards more reading the text. So cognition is a combination of intuition and understanding. So I'm kind of recording the class. If you don't want to use your data from your phone, you can just not connect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm here. It's fine. I'm not sure if I can use the video. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. As long as you are following this.
All right, thank you.
So um, like if even cognition is it is it a midway between intuition and understanding, or is it one? No, I don't think midway is not the right word. Is it what mediates sort of intuition and understanding? Is that okay?
Well, it is the combination of the two. So, but you are asking all the right questions that should push you to read further, because all the answers to these questions are going to come, because that's literally what he starts explaining after the introduction in no, actually, even at the beginning of the introduction. There can be no doubt that all our cognition begins its experience, for what else might rouse our cognitive power and to its operation if objects stirring our senses did not do so. Now, but that doesn't mean that all our knowledge comes or starts with experience, but does not mean that it all arises from experience. So experience, intuition, sensibility, yet even for something to be a sensible intuition for us, it has to conform our subjective forms of intuition. namely time and space. And it is good that they are subjective because we can make universal claims about what is subjective. We can never make universal claims about what is objective, which is a really great point to remember if you don't remember anything from Kant, that all the so-called objective statements are contingent and particular. Yes, Sukmin.
I'm I'm sorry, but uh, can you just briefly explain to me again about the example of triangles in mathematics? I don't quite understand why we like how we draw a connection.
Well, the distinction that he makes with respect to science, for example, and mathematics is in science, our intuitions are supplied by the external world. You observe things, you look outside. In mathematics, especially in geometry, because we are talking about the triangle, the intuition is not supplied by the external world, but produced by human imagination.
Human imagination. Yeah.
Yes, like triangle. Here, I imagine a triangle. I imagine a perfect two-dimensional object that doesn't and cannot exist because objects are three-dimensional. I draw it, you look at it, and I prove to you, I'm sure that some mathematicians do that, I'm not going to do that, that the inner circles of a triangle is at 180 degrees. I guess you can just pull that, 180 minus this. I'm sure that there's a mathematical proposition here.
I was gonna ask what the connection, what is the like, I mean, when you say like, oh, this thing indicates something that exists in three-dimensional, I mean, it doesn't exist three-dimensionally, like a triangle is just the concept itself. So like the triangle that we draw, right, is a symbol. So I was wondering if, I don't know.
Well, the problem with symbols, to use the language of symbol, is
Well, I just meant when we draw it, right? It's just a it's like a
representation.
It's just when you draw the triangle, like we have the English word triangle, right? But if you want somebody from anywhere else, like the language, aside from the language, you can draw a triangle and like people usually understand what that is.
Sure.
It's a symbol for itself, even though when we draw it, we make it three-dimensional. So
Okay, perfect. Yes.
I don't know if I was.
No.
Is there a connection between the
Well,
symbology and like things like intuition and understanding? Because the symbol itself is not tangible. A symbol does not exist in three-dimensional space. It's simply something that we use to indicate what does not exist in three-dimensional space.
Well, is it possible to think it in relation to symbol? Sure. I mean, I still want to. What's that?
Sorry, the way you said sure sounds like no.
No, like, but triangle can be a symbol of something else. Like, I can imagine if you show a triangle to someone from another part of the world, they might think that for us, triangle.
Oh yeah, like a
symbolize.
stop sign or something like that.
What's that?
Like a slow sign, because it can have attached meaning.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it can be a sign for something, but I mean like when you just like if you strip away the context,
Yeah.
it only indicates itself.
Okay, but something that only symbolizes itself, I'm not really sure that would technically be a symbol. That's why I'm confused. Like, it is possible because symbol must be like symbolian, like bringing something from another context. So it's like allegory and all these kind of tropes in language that they all come from the ancient Greek. Like symbalein is literally like bringing in. So I'm not sure that it can be a symbol of itself. But your intuition is correct. Like triangle, something that everybody would mathematically, because it's a human intuition, that is true for all. It fits our perception or our intuition that is three-dimensional
Well, I
space.
was just thinking the image of the triangle, right, indicates to us the
Yeah.
Even if I see a sign from anywhere else, if it's triangle shaped, I understand it. The image itself indicates to me
Uh-huh.
that it's a triangle. I don't know how to.
Okay, let's make it a little more complicated. Um,
But I think like his what he said is it sort of similar to like I guess I don't know. I think he mentioned somewhere in the text the thing about like pure concept kind of thing.
Oh, yes.
So like in that sense, would a triangle be the sort of
Because like when we draw it, like it's only a means to indicate the intuition. Like, and like it's different from language because language has so much other stuff.
let's make it a little bit more complicated. So this is Pythagorean theorem. So this is 16, right? And this is 9, and that is 25. Therefore, we say it's 25. This is a proof that the square of the hypotenuse of rectangular 90 degrees, like what do you call those?
Right triangle. Right triangle.
Right triangle, yes, right? Right triangle is the subtotal of these two sides. Now, this is something that I can demonstrate intuitively by producing this according to Kant. And in fact, I can do the calculation to actually prove it. Now, that is more like intuition, and it's not a symbol. It is more like a geometrical calculation that might illustrate the point a little better rather than concentrating on the symbol. Because I don't just produce a triangle. With geometry, I produce intuitions that go beyond mere things, but I produce theorems, Euclidean geometry, the rules, and blah, blah. So that goes beyond that it's becoming a symbol. So production of intuition. That I can do as a rational being. That's why mathematics is cool and he likes it, but doesn't really give us anything about the world. It only teaches us about our own intuition. Yes, the world usually fits mathematics, but do you believe, like, for example, if you were to find a triangular object with right angle, I don't know why you would do this, but if they tell you this side is 4, this side is 3, how much do you think that this side is so that I can go buy some cloth to put on it? I would say 5. It works with respect to the external world. I would buy 5 meters because I can imagine if it is 4 and 3, that would have to be 5. And that will work with respect to the external world. But it's not supplied by the external world because I can never go around and look at all the triangle looking things and measure their stuff and somehow say, oh, this is 5 too. Oh, this is 5 too. Maybe this is a generalizable claim. It is not produced by intuitions from outside. It is produced by us. That's why mathematics is really cool. You should study it. Yes.
So really, do intuitions simply come from like pattern recognition? Like we recognize these similar patterns, like triangles that appear in nature, or these theorems that create these patterns, and that's where the intuition comes from. We recognize that it's like this similar concept that keeps on happening, and so it must have some significance.
But historically, maybe, I mean, one can speculate that would be another external, like, I've never seen triangles that I noticed until I came to elementary school and they started teaching us about geometry. So, but somebody might have. But the origin of this knowledge, according to him, is a priori, not empirical. Because if it were empirical, you could never come up with a theorem. Because a theorem is necessary and universal. And somebody would say, how do you know that? Did you measure all the triangles in the world? No, I measured 25. Go measure another 750. It maybe won't work with those. But you said, no, it's not about that. It's about the principle, the triangle, this intuitive object that I can symbolize or represent to you and demonstrate to you mathematically, prove to you. Therefore, I would say it's beyond pattern recognition because pattern recognition is still empirical. It is more like a power of human, and I don't know what is it. Let's say reason. It covers all of them. Reason has like sensibility a little bit, but also understanding, etc. So now we were on page 21. I just want to say this assumption already agrees better with the demanded possibility of an a priori cognition of objects, a cognition that is to ascertain something about them before they are given. Then he says something like completely bizarre, which is the situation here is the same as what of Copernicus when he first thought of explaining the motion of celestial bodies, which I always thought this is exactly the opposite of Copernicus. I don't even know why he is giving the example of Copernicus, because Copernicus says, okay, if we imagine that everything revolves around us, we don't make any progress. Let's just imagine that all the planets are revolving around the sun, but not around the earth. Kant says, well, everything really revolves around us, like around human beings. Of course, it's not like simple like that, like a human subject, but the question of subjectivity. So objects must conform to us, not we to objects. That's why when you come to 20th century, after this Kantian revolution, people say things like, oh, wherever we go, we find ourselves, we find human beings in nature. And it is not like that knowledge is invalid, that knowledge is bad, that knowledge is unreliable, etc. But we performed, according to Kant, this activity of self-cognition and explained what it means to be knowledge for us. And that's good because it's universal and necessary. Anything subjective, like from now on, like, because we understand subject like your subject or subject, everybody's subject type of thing. But that's not what subjectivity means. It is the structure of human reason for all of us. To the extent that we all perceive in space and time. Also, we have concepts, which we haven't gotten to that yet. So, having found it difficult to make progress there when he assumed that the entire host of stars revolves around the spectator, he tried to find out by experiment whether he might not be more successful if he had the spectator revolve and the stars remained at rest. Yeah, I guess that's what Copernicus did, right? So, because I mean, you imagine yourself stable and things are revolving around you, star, and then say, do you like that's completely like counter to our experience, isn't it?
It's counter to our experience and kind of counter to the whole idea of reason, I think, because reason is simply we understand things because we project these concepts onto these things.
Yeah.
We get conclusions.
Yeah, I would be careful with the projection part because that sounds too kind of subjectivist in the way that we understand it. But you're right; they have to conform to certain rules of our own understanding. Yeah, which is the basic idea. Are you guys clear over there? Um, any questions, Sukmin, Wilson? How is it going, Will?
Yeah,
You wrote your name as
I'm a
Will.
little bit lost. So are we talking about a priori and the relationship with math and
I heard the part a priori, but not the relationship part.
okay.
What is the relationship with that?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I didn't hear your question.
Oh no, it wasn't a question. I just wanted to make sure I'm on the same page. Where like what are we talking about in the text?
On page 21.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe it's easier to, if we cannot connect to type. Okay. Now, we can try a similar experiment in metaphysics, similar to Copernicus. With regard to intuition of objects, if our intuition had to conform to the character of its object, then I do not see how we would know anything a priori about that character. That's always a posteriori. If we try to fit our concepts to objects, that's always true science. But I can quite readily conceive of this possibility if the object, as the object of the senses, conform to the character of our own of power of intuition. However, if these intuitions are to become cognitions, I cannot remain with them, must refer to them as presentation to something or other as their object, and must determine this object by means of them. Since for this determination I require concept, I must make one of these two assumptions. I can assume that the concepts by means of which I bring about this determination likewise to conform to object, which is not the case. And in that case, I'm again in the same perplexity as to how I can know anything a priori about that object. Or else I assume that the objects, or what amounts to the same, these are objects of experience, and I'll talk about that in a second. The experience in which alone they can be cognized conform to those concepts. Just listen to this. Objects, which is pretty much the same as the experience in which alone they can be cognized. So even here, he suggests that objects are what is given to us in experience. Objects and the content of experience is the same. On later assumption, I can immediately see an easier way out. For experience is itself a way of cognizing for which I need understanding. Now, concepts go with understanding and intuitions with sensibility. We'll discuss the details of that. But he uses two different terms for object. Object is the Latin word, it's the more general word. But the German word is Gegenstand. Gegenstand literally means that which stands and over and against. So, that's what's that. So, objects as Gegenstand, which is the literal meaning of the term object in German, is that which stands over and against me. And that object is only in relation to me. And with Kant, we really need to start thinking objects and subjects not as separate unitary entities, but relationships. Object is only an object in relation to me, and I am only a subject in relation to the object. This is going to be a huge deal with Hegel after Kant, but even in Kant, we start this idea of understanding philosophical concepts not as freestanding things, but as relations. Now, Ding an sich, which is the term that he uses for thing in itself in German, it is hyphenated, but I can't do hyphenate now. Ding an sich, on the other hand, is his translation of, is translated as thing in itself, which is by definition that which is not in relation to us. And to be in relation to us really means to be in space and time. That's it. So thing in itself is literally that which is not in space and time. And Kant, after Hume, we are going to see how he learns from Hume and empiricism and comes to this conclusion, believes that we cannot know anything that is not given to us in space and time. Know it, strictly speaking. Yes.
Um, so so let's suppose that okay, so this is my cell phone and simultaneously it can be Ding an sich and Gegenstand at the same time.
Well, that object in itself cannot be anything. He says, if if that space is in space and time and given to your cognition, to your ability to know, then it is a presentation, it's a Gegenstand.
So is Gegenstand something artificial, something that was produced by human mind?
Well, so is thing in itself. It is not produced by human mind. Something is given. So you need to think of the object in two different modalities, two different relations. These are not two different things. So therefore, we are moving from this object ontology to more like a relation ontology. An object in general, in relation to us, it's Gegenstand. It is defined as such. Our forms of intuition and our concepts define it as such because it is given to us. Then you can also imagine that object as not given to us. But you cannot really ask any meaningful question about what it is because it is not given to us. I am sort of Kant does allowing the possibility that the world, not our world, but the world can exist outside of space and time. But
But
that is a conceptual distinction. It is not a real distinction. Not one is artificial, one is real, etc. It's a conceptual distinction. I can imagine the world in relation to me, but I must also imagine the world as not in relation.
but when you said that Gegenstand is something that stands in relation to me, that means that Gegenstand is in space and time. And as you said, space and time are the forms of intuitions that are inherent in us.
Yeah.
So doesn't that mean that then Gegenstand is already, how to say, perceived, intuited by us, so that it's no more it no more belongs to the object itself.
Yes, of course it doesn't belong to the object.
So Gegenstand is, well, why do I keep think that?
Because you are still thinking objective as something more real than Gegenstand. You are still thinking that if something is in relation to us, thereby it is somehow contaminated and lost
No.
its reality and became.
Yes.
That's why
Yeah, that
you call it artificial, or what did you call it?
yeah, that's how I thought. I mean, it's already contaminated by human intuition. So
What you
I
call
mean,
contamination for Kant is the possibility of cognition.
the contamination is the possibility of cognition.
I mean, I put contamination in quotation marks, but I mean, what you consider to be, because it is a particular kind of prejudice, and Hegel is really going to work out that prejudice really well, that we somehow think that when we know the world, we are somehow distorting it. And Kant says, no, knowing the world is a relation, and we can work out the proper way of knowing the world because that's what knowledge is. It's also a relationship between us and the objects. We are not contaminating, subjectivizing, distorting the world. We are establishing a relationship and we are understanding the nature of that relationship. Esther has a question. Yeah.
So how, if Kant believes that there is a way in which we can understand the world, like know the world, how does the fact that we cannot know the thing in itself relate to that concept?
Because thing in itself, by definition, is something that which is not given to us. So if you ask, like, how can we know something that is not given to us? Well, we can't. We defined it as such. We allow that possibility. Then you can't just sort of consistently ask, how can I know what I cannot know? I don't know. You defined it as what I cannot know in order to restrict the powers of reason. So remember that like the question that you are asking, like how can we know thing in itself, is precisely the first harassment of reason performs on itself. Like, how can I know that? Like, you can't. You defined it as such. You are searching something outside of space and time. And to be honest, it doesn't even make sense. I mean, it makes sense. We can communicate with each other. But intuitively, what does it mean to be outside of time? Like, even if we say that God is outside of time, it just means like eternal. It just lasts very long. Like, I don't understand what it means for God to be outside of time. And sort of, how can something that is outside of time just sort of randomly enter into time and do things like send his son and blah, blah, or whatever, and not get that? No, it just doesn't make sense. So, but that's okay for Kant, because reason should not attempt to answer all the questions that it tries to pose to itself. Now, thing in itself can be understood morally as I'm outside of time. Namely, I have a dimension as human being, thing in itself, but that is not knowledge. That is what is morality. We can talk about it, we will somewhat, but that's not theoretical knowledge. Therefore, morality cannot be known. Therefore, we are having trouble, right?
So morality,
from Daniel, yeah.
yeah. So like morality, God, those kinds of questions those are like the things he calls like unconditioned.
Yeah.
Things like those kind of
Well,
things.
that's more like God, but yeah.
More about God. But so morality is not. So he doesn't see morality because like has to like that, right? Like the practical use of reason.
Well, he does write critique of pure reason and how pure practical reason and how it should work. But like, okay, it is 1781, 1787 that we do today believe in a very straightforward distinction between descriptive and normative, right? If something is normative, it's not descriptive. We say what ought to be the case, what should be the case, which is different than, oh, this is the case. Because if we restrict ourselves to the is, then human morality is meaningless, because we do what we are doing. Now, some people try to explain morality in terms of what is. It is actually nothing but a manifestation of deeper laws of nature in which, according to which human beings are supposed to act out of selfish reasons for power, etc. They try to explain morality in terms of description. Well, maybe under some interpretation, Nietzsche is doing that, but it's a little bit more complicated. But then you don't have morality, you don't have thing in itself, you just always have appearances, because you claim to know what the origin of morality is. But for Kant, you shouldn't know. It should not be a theoretical knowledge. It should be a practical question beyond the bounds of knowledge, theoretical knowledge. So therefore, he reserves the thing in itself as that for morality. Now, you might not believe in thing in itself and say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Of course it doesn't make sense. It's not supposed to make sense theoretically. What do you mean I'm outside of time? I'm always in time. Is there a dimension of me that is not affected by causality? But we live with this irrationality constantly. I mean, the principle of it, like, We punish people for committing crime. How do we do that? Because every crime has a cause that you did not create. You are not responsible for. And why should I be punished for something that I didn't make or just had to conform? I'm just following laws of nature. But then we attribute this kind of mystical power to us. We say, no, you are not just subject to laws of nature that can be known, but you have this thing in itself. Like you can always do differently and you should do differently. It's like, where does that come from? How do I say like I ought not to do that if I'm like a mere mortal following laws of nature? So we do that. We do that all the time. So that's thing in itself. Object not in, I not in relation to nature. I imagine myself not in relation to nature. And it is an imagination, really. I don't know theoretically what that means. And maybe that's why we are all going to become like machines soon. Which nobody really thinks about, like how human beings are becoming machines rather than machines substituting us. Which is always our dystopias is about like, machines, artificial intelligence is going to come and invade us, etc. I think it's actually worse. We are already moving towards becoming machines in terms of our causality anyway. So, but that's stupid speculation. So, yes, we can take a not so quick break until 11 because I'm tired and this is literally choking me. Okay, we'll get back at 11.
Is it?
Okay, just on the page 25, I want to indicate this use of the term suprasensible, beyond sensible, and that he sees as the domain of the practical reason. Now, he's not going to talk about practical reason at all in this text, well, just tangentially, not explicitly. So, for the purpose of the critique of pure reason, we are really restricted to the sensible realm, that which cannot be, that which can be known, that which can be perceived. So, just going through the questions that I gave you for the reading, I think the idea what Kant's revolutionary idea is pretty clear. That is the idea of objects conforming to us rather than we conforming to objects. And his definition of metaphysics can be understood with respect to suprasensible, namely going beyond the limits of experience and trying to make claims that are universal and necessary. Now, for you, it is still important to understand why in any science you need to be able to make a priori proposition. In the sense that if everything you say is a posteriori, it is contingent and particular, then you are really not advancing any systemic knowledge. It has to be a priori in the sense that he defines a priori first, in the first instance, prior to experience. But priority, as he will later explain, is not simply a temporal priority. Because I can know certain things with reasonable confidence that if I burn down this building one day, it will collapse. But this is not an a priori knowledge because the effect of burning and collapsing, etc., it is something that I learned from experience. A priori really means prior to all experience, prior to all possibility of experience. Hence, he defines it in terms of two elements, universality and necessity. Hence, by definition, a posteriori is not universal, i.e. always particular, because you have this experience, that experience, and you can never conclude anything general from particular experiences. And it is not necessary in the sense that even if I know something to be the case, it is not necessarily the case, it can be otherwise. So this is a priori and a posteriori. What does intuition mean? That's always going to be a question, but it is the content of our sensibility, let's say, and we'll define that with respect to presentations, that there is an extended footnote that you should read on presentation, that the translator translates Vorstellung as presentation rather than representation, because these are not just simple ideas or images in our minds as Van Locke, Berkeley, etc. would have it. For Kant, presentation simply the way in which object is given to us. You look at things and it's presented to you. Thing in itself is Ding an sich, which is associated with suprasensible, that which goes beyond our space and time sensibility. Now, of course, he's going to use thing in itself in different terms with respect to, different contexts with respect to morality, but we don't really need to worry about that. Right? Why is the purpose of a critic of pure reason? What the hell does that mean? What is the purpose of the critic of pure reason? So that I think is pretty clear in terms of drawing the boundaries of reason. You understand the positive and the negative aspect of, he uses a very,
That's actually, I kind of got stuck on page
29 or 27. Starts on 27.
27.
Mhm.
Yes. I got very, very lost. As far as I was able to understand it, it's both positive and negative, because in terms of negative, it restricts the use of speculative reason. Because it expands on the bounds of sensibility until it encompasses everything. It kind of transcends just the realms of sensibility, starts thinking about these other concepts that you can't experience.
So it restricts them, therefore it's negative.
And therefore it's negative. But in the same way, it's positive because it eliminates those obstacles, it limits those bounds of sensibility, and you can start thinking about these more abstract concepts.
Well, here he really uses the term positive as italicized on page 27 with respect to practical use of reason. So it makes morality possible. So restriction of theoretical knowledge, it's good that you don't speculate, it is negative, therefore, but it also allows the possibility of practical reason, because if we understand freedom as a theoretical concept that we can observe in the external world, practical philosophy would be impossible because there is no way to demonstrate freedom. He says freedom at least does not contradict with the sensible realm, because it doesn't apply to the sensible realm. It applies to what he calls later on page 29, the intellectual, not sensible, but intellectual. That way he can make room for both of them and not contradicting each other. Therefore, we need to be very careful not to explain morality according to Kant in terms of natural causes. Because biologists sometimes do that, physiologists sometimes do that if they still exist. So they're sort of like, this is human morality. It's a tool for survival. But for Kant, that really annihilates morality, because then morality becomes something that can be known as an empirical field of knowledge. So that's why the positive aspect of it is we can still meaningfully talk about what ought to be case from an intelligible realm, not a sensible realm. So we can always say, yes, it is the case, but it should not be the case. Or it should be different. It ought to be different. So what ought to be doesn't contradict what is, because they don't belong to the same realm.
So this will be how you respond to like Hume's thing, right?
Turn on your thing. See, you forget to.
Yeah. So so this is how he sort of resolves Hume's like his is this by saying they don't belong to the same realm as that sort of resolves that.
For him, yes. For him, yes. He resolves that issue by saying that freedom applies to supersensible realm and as objects in themselves, rather than as appearances that is the object of knowledge. So that's the positive and negative value of the critique. Why will a critic of reason decide the question of the possibility of metaphysics? That's pretty clear that it is going to allow what is, it's going to determine what is within the reach of reason and what is not. What are the speculative and practical reasons? Speculative is really theoretical, cognitive, I mean, I shouldn't say cognitive, knowledge, right? As you understand, how do they differ it? And one refers to the intelligible realm, one refers to the sensible realm. And then he says that critique is against dogmatism because, yes, I might be able, and you might sneer at me, and you might think that I am being too pretentious when I say I solve all the problems of metaphysics, but I solve them not by providing you answers. So I'm not dogmatic or pretentious. I just solve them sort of technically in the sense that why you cannot have solutions to certain questions. And he is going to talk about that. Unfortunately, since we are not reading the whole text, we are not going to talk about antinomy, but he's going to talk about the dialectic of reason in the sense that certain questions can never be answered because one side or the other side of the argument are equally valid or equally invalid. Therefore, these questions are beyond the scope of metaphysics. It is still negative in the sense that restricts the speculation of reason, but it has that positive impact of allowing the possibility of morality. Yes. Well, I gave one causality. That would be an example. The beginning of time, the beginning of space. Those are questions. Yeah, those are four antinomies. I gave you the entire book, so if you guys want to read that, that's in the dialectical. So paralogism, antinomies. Yeah, it gets really technical for Kant, but just since this is almost like an introductory class to Kant, those are the types of questions that both the thesis and the antithesis are equally valid, or both the thesis and the antithesis are equally invalid. So there's a beginning of time, there is no beginning of time. They are both equally unanswerable. But if you say there is causality or there is freedom, everything is determined by causality, but there is also freedom. That can be resolved by saying, yes, everything in nature, it happens according to laws of nature, but there is a morality with respect to thing in itself, freedom that exceeds, and that belongs to the supersensible realm, thing in itself. Which always also poses a lot of problems. Like when we act, we always act in space and time. And the question will always be, how are we capable of acting outside of space and time?
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking itself and I act, but how do I interfere into the yeah.
But would that be a question that doesn't make sense to ask?
Which one?
The one about how, like, how do you act outside space and time? Like, according to like this.
Yeah, not for Kant. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, he has a moral action I mean, he talks about presentations that we produce. So we produce presentation from this mysterious realm of freedom, thinking itself supersensible, etc. But we act within the physical world. So I cannot not follow the laws of nature, even if I'm being moral. So, I mean, for example, if I could, I would just solve the problem of poverty in the world. That would be a really good moral behavior. But I still have the reality of acting in a world. So therefore, we make these claims like, what should I do? But we always encounter that should in terms of possibility, because otherwise people say, oh, you are just a dreamer and you are an idealist, you are stupid, blah, blah. But everybody probably would agree that we should end poverty in the world, whatever that means. People should not die because of not having fresh water, more than all the other people who died in COVID in the United States. So that's a fairly, to me, unproblematic, or what ought to be the case. But there's a reality of negotiating the resources in the world.
So the art can, like that art can come from the art can come from a place that is like, can come from the super sensible.
Yeah.
But then to make that into an actual, we have to
Still act. And it has to come from super sensible, because if it comes from the sensible, then you can explain it in terms of my anthropological and physiological desire to be helpful to people. It can be explained by my desire to be liked or um, to be admired, which is a social anthropological phenomenon. And maybe 99% of the people pretend to be moral because they like to be approved. They want to appear to be nice, and you observe this. Like, everybody is incredibly moral when they present themselves to public, but how come the world is not a better place as a result? Because, that can be explained in terms of laws of nature. Like, you just want popularity. Okay, I can't talk anymore.
So where can I? Yeah.
So we'll continue to introduction. So I think it would be a good natural separation in terms of assignments, like read the introduction for Tuesday, read Transcendental Aesthetics on Thursday, but that will make how many weeks though? Anyway, it'll be fine. So this is next week. That's our second week, right? And then third week, and then maybe transcendental deduction. So for Tuesday, try to read up to the end of Transcendental Aesthetics. 84.
Or
Yeah, just two sections, the introduction and the Transcendental Aesthetics.
sorry, Fred, when is it due? Tuesday?
I don't know whether we can cover all of it, but now, of course, there are parts of the preface that are written subsequently. So he makes certain observations that don't make sense because he already wrote the book. So he writes the first version in 1781, and that's the part that preface first edition. And as you see, the numbers, marginal numbers are always A in that. And then in the second edition, they're exclusively B. And then when you come to the introduction, A and B start overlapping. And then that's going to go all the way to up to page 150, I think. Yes, and the 150, I think 50, yeah, 150. That is exclusively first edition. That's also going to be just A, and then that's the end. So if you are just sort of have nothing to do this weekend, if you want to be superhuman or beyond human or something, you can read up to page 150 and be ready for transcendental deduction. Or you can even go up to page 174 if you choose. That's all that we are going to cover. So why don't I assign that for Tuesday, and then you do it on your own pace. So that's going to be the whole assignment from Kant up to page 174. I'm not assigning it, Will. Don't like.
What's the assigned, or what's the bottom? What's the minimum expected?
What? Okay, you are a senior in philosophy.
I'm just curious, you know, we need to know the bottom minimum.
Don't be curious about these things. That's like, you know, don't get like Kevin on you right now. I would say that you should read up to the end of Transcendental Aesthetic, 84. So that's about 44 pages. It's gonna be long and hard. So. Yes, Sukmin.
Can I ask you something more about suprasensible?
Of course.
So is that like a sensibility? The ability of sensing something suprasensible?
No, suprasensible is beyond sensible.
Beyond sensible.
Yeah.
So is it the ability or the object which is being sensed, or
It's the object that is not sensed.
the object that is not sensed? So is it equivalent to the term Ding an sich?
Yes.
Okay.
But we don't know that. So therefore it is the practical reason, not theoretical reason.
So it is a practical reason.
Well, it concerns practical reason. It is not something that we can know. It is not the object of theoretical reason. It's not the question. It's not the subject matter of the critical pure reason.
And it resides in the domain of intellectual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we don't have intellectual intuition. All our intuitions are sensible. I don't even know how you can imagine an intellectual intuition, but Kant believes that maybe God could just think of something and it would just appear. But we don't have that power. The what? The what? I want to say no, but let me try to understand the question. Intellectual a priori, I'm not really sure I want to say in the realm of a priori, because a priori is still cognition and it has necessary and universal dimension, you know what? Yes, sure. Like when you move to the practical philosophy, okay, so you can observe people doing certain things, and you can become an anthropologist, an ethnographer nowadays, and you can explain people's moral behaviors, moral codes. And that's usually how we sort of explain moral relativism. So, in one society, you do this, in this culture, you do this. Therefore, you should not impose your criteria upon other cultures. And you can negotiate their different morality. Although we still have issues with that too, both sides. Like, the Western culture is degraded and terrible, blah, blah, and the Eastern culture is back, blah, blah. We make all these kind of prejudicial claims. But the realm of morality is that is common reason for all human beings. Therefore, yes, it must be universal and necessary and hence a priori. Now, if you don't believe that and believe that Kant is like an imperialist European who imposes his own morality upon other people, which is cool, then, but you also remove the possibility of any kind of moral negotiation among people. Then you are going to say some people are moral, some people aren't. Some people have the capacity to make moral judgments, some people aren't, because you don't have a unifying reason according to which you can conceptualize morality. Now, for Kant, everybody, regardless, not that they should follow certain empirical rules, but everybody has the capacity to be moral because of reason. Now, you might not agree with respect to empirical laws that appear as a result of that reasoning, like in one culture, I don't know, like think of an example, like it's immoral to drive a car in certain. And then you say, no, there's nothing immoral about it. But by disagreeing with that, you are always relying on the possibility of they are as much capable of morality as I. All human beings are. That's the. So therefore, it's a priori, yes, universal and necessary.
I think I had another question on the suprasensible.
Suprasensible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it makes sense to say this, but like,
So
so it doesn't work intuition, right? We don't,
Yeah.
but we know it's there, kind of. But then, like,
We don't really know it's there. It's not there. It is the way in which our reason is structured. This is self-cognition, right? So reason searching the moral principles within itself. It's beautiful. I mean, even if it's wrong, it's beautiful because that kind of self-reflection and that desire to attribute to all rational beings. Like nobody is exempt from this. They are neither not capable nor not responsible for morality. And it's not there, but he thinks it has its own rational cognition. Like he says, like morality cannot come from religion because, somebody is of a particular religion and people like, my morality comes from religion. And you say, fine, I have to respect you because of some political laws, etc. But you're wrong. Because if you are not within that religion, then you are not only capable of morality, but also not responsible for morality. So if I'm not a Christian, if your morality comes from Christianity, I can kill you without any moral problems because I'm not only incapable, but also not responsible. So what is that only a priori universal thing that can apply to all human beings? Reason. The only thing that can be applied to all human beings universally and necessarily as the basis of morality is reason for Kant. It can't be culture, it can't be religion, it can't be anything. It can't be nature.
I guess I'm still serious.
I don't know. Like to agree, like this should require the have
That's the super sensible
in
in
some
some
way,
and
and like
like
Yeah.
very
Yeah, yeah. Thinking though, not intuitive. By thinking. And I still believe that human salvation is in human thinking, the ability to be thoughtful rather than being exposed to different empirical things.
but in the process
process
of
of
thinking,
thinking. Is it? I don't know. Ah, it's like it's something interesting because like so like are you distinguishing things?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Kant doesn't, but at least there are different kind of cognition. It is not a theoretical knowledge of something that is already there. It is a cognition, it's a practical cognition. It is understanding the way in which reason thinks about morality. And Kant says, once I expose this, as a rational being, you are going to agree with me because this is not just simply my opinion empirically, but it is the way in which I describe how human mind works. And yours works like that too. So when I say morality cannot come from religion, even if you are an incredibly religious person, you ought to agree that it cannot. Rational. So he says in this domain there is no opinion. It's just the way in which we are trying to understand human thinking, human reason. That's cognition.
I have a question.
So this is like Kant's moral philosophy in 15 minutes. Yes. Oh, go ahead. Wait, yeah. Go ahead.
Uh,
When someone
yeah.
talks in class, I turn off my uh, volume because then it echoes. So go ahead. Sorry.
Um, I think I'm a little bit confused because we talked about the division between what is and what is ought to be, and we made that distinction by dividing the term theoretical and practical.
Uh-huh.
And I remember that the room for faith. I mean, this kind of expression belongs to practical knowledge, and so does the concept of morality.
Uh-huh.
But
Yes. So you thought then, therefore, morality and faith are the same?
no, I was going to say, uh, yeah, that's an interesting point. But what I was going to say is that so the practical knowledge is about the object, not the Gegenstand, but Ding an sich, which is an object.
No. No, not
No,
in the same way. No, no. So that is not an object of cognition.
not the object. Oh, not the object of cognition, but the object itself.
Well, okay, so you are making this kind of, uh, if I'm speculating correctly. So you look at this uh, pen and you say, there is this pen as an object, Gegenstand, over and against me, and then there is a thing in itself in this object.
Yeah.
That's not the case. For Kant, there's only one thing here. you can think of this as a rational human being in relation to me. And you can also think of it not in relation to me. Conceptually, when it is in relation to me, it's Gegenstand. And conceptually, when it is not in relation to me, it is thing in itself.
So both Gegenstand and Ding an sich are conceptual term, not the substantive
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
but what I was going to say is, but practical knowledge is about the thing itself, not the perceived Gegenstand.
But not
And
things as like practical knowledge, me in relation to the world, in which I am subject to natural laws, but also me as thing in itself, not in relation to the external world, as a thing in itself, which who is free. Therefore, I can be moral.
therefore, I can be moral.
Yes, my my the principle of my action can be universalized. Therefore, it can be rational and it can be moral. So I can imagine myself as free, as a thing in itself. Now, if you ever read Schelling, and you should read Schelling, Schelling thinks a little bit like you do, and he says, like, how about things? We can think of them not in relation to the world, and they might have freedom too. Why do you attribute freedom only to human beings? So you are thinking this correctly. So you understood what is at stake here. So, but for Kant, it is only in moral philosophy with respect to human beings that we understand thing in itself. I don't know myself thing in itself, but I can be moral. I obviously don't know things in things as things in themselves, but that has nothing to do with morality.
How can eliminating the relation be related to having morality, which is universal?
Because I am not totally and exclusively determined by my relationship to the world.
Would you please state it again?
Because I'm not exclusively determined by my relationship to the world, because I'm not only subject to laws of nature.
Mm.
Because in relation to the world, I'm always following laws of nature. Then there is no morality. Then we are just post-human machines. That we need to do what we are naturally inclined to do. Which might be true. I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying that I 100% agree with Kant, but for him, if you want to talk about morality, you need to allow the possibility that we are not in relation to the world, such that I personally agree that you should not hold people responsible for things that they need to do by laws of nature. You shouldn't punish them. You shouldn't hold them responsible for, I'm hungry, I'm going to eat. And they say, well, don't kill people if you want to eat. But I'm hungry. No, you should not have killed people to eat, go to jail. Then there's a presupposition that I can not just be in relation to the world and my hunger, but I can make decisions from somewhere else. That thing in itself. Because I'm just like, I need to eat. I'm see, getting close to noon. I'm getting hungry. So that's the natural tendency.
Okay, and could you please elaborate more on the notion that on the question that is morality faith?
Okay, so that's a good question because there are two aspects of the unconditioned that comes here. Now, Kant separates three ideas of reason. That's immortality of the soul, freedom, and God. So the domain of the morality is exclusively freedom. That concerns freedom. Now, with respect to God, Kant has a really amazing explanation of God. God is not an object. God is not something that can be known. God is not an idea like morality, so it is unconditioned in a different way, and that was your question. But Kant, God is really an idea of reason. This search is exactly the same problem if you are really Kantian, and if you really want to stick with Kant, it is the first sentence of the text when he says, God is a concept that reason invents for itself and harasses itself because at some point God seems to be moving back to conditions to something that is unconditioned. And then people try to explain God in terms of intelligent design or first cause, etc. But you don't need to confuse that with morality. He says morality still is morality, but the concept of God is a tendency in reason to follow a certain pattern, follow a certain set of conditions, and come up with the idea. And then some people think that just because they have the idea, like Descartes, it must be real. But it's not. In fact, it shouldn't be real. I mean, technically, it's good that God doesn't exist because if God were to exist, it would be in spatio-temporal terms, which would be objectively known through the senses and could never be something good for us. Yeah. Condition. This is condition before condition. You know, people say like, you know, in intelligent design, for example, they say like, oh, this works. There must be some kind of a unconditioned first cause of all of this. God.
So does the term condition mean that implied that there is a how to say preceding cause for that?
Well, Esther is going to explain to you what condition condition means. Esther knows that.
So conditioned is like determined by the forms of intuition and categories, or that which the human mind can know. So the unconditioned is that which is kind of beyond the bounds of reason, that which the human mind cannot know through intuition.
God, the idea of God is unconditioned because there's
The idea of God because you can't use intuition or reason to like prove that he exists or it exists. But we come to the idea of God through these conditioned principles. So there's like a pattern of conditioned principles that lead to the unconditioned idea of God.
Good. Yes. Exactly. She asked me this question before. You got it, Shira? She asked me this question before, so that's why we were negotiating. God does not exist, and God should not exist because if God were to exist, it would be really bad for God. Because it would be a conditioned being in space and time. Because existence for Kant means being in space and time. And God must be an idea, must be beyond our comprehensibility. It must be just a question of faith. Because if we really try to explain God rationally to human beings in terms of theoretical reason, we are not doing any service to God. In fact, what we are doing is killing God, which is exactly what we did when God put his son on earth. We had to kill. I mean, not we, I didn't have anything to do with it, but like you know, some people did it as human beings. Yes, it's an idea. It's an idea of human reason. So like when you have vice presidential debates,